David Richardson stared at his laptop screen in disbelief. The deal he'd been working on for 6 months had just fallen apart in a single phone call. $20 million gone. His assistant knocked on his office door, probably with another crisis to handle, but David waved her away. For the first time in years, he actually had nothing urgent to do. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built his software company from nothing, working 18-hour days in a cramped apartment, surviving on instant noodles and determination. Now at 35, he was worth more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. His education software was used in schools across 40 countries. Presidents called him for advice. Tech magazines put his face on their covers. But success had come, with a price he was only now beginning to understand. David walked to his corner office window and looked down at the bustling streets of downtown Seattle. Somewhere out there, normal people were living normal lives. They went home to their families every night. They knew their children's favorite foods and their biggest fears. They didn't spend their weekends in conference rooms or their vacations answering emails. His phone buzzed with a text from his father back in Ohio. "Hope you're doing well, son. Sophie had her first swimming lesson yesterday. She's getting so big." The message included a photo of his 8-year-old daughter in a bright pink swimsuit, giving a thumbs up to the camera. David's heart squeezed. When was the last time he'd taken her swimming? When was the last time they'd done anything together that didn't involve him checking his phone every 5 minutes? After his wife died in a car accident 3 years ago, David had thrown himself into work even harder. It was easier than dealing with the grief, easier than learning how to be a single parent. His father had stepped in without question, offering to take care of Sophie during the school year while David traveled for business. It seemed like the perfect solution. His dad loved having his granddaughter around, and his new wife, Patricia, had seemed genuinely excited about becoming a grandmother figure. David grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. His secretary looked surprised when he told her to cancel his meetings for the rest of the week. "Sir, you have the Johnson presentation on Thursday and the board meeting on Friday. Reschedule everything," David said, already heading for the elevator. "I'm going home." The flight from Seattle to Columbus gave him 3 hours to think. He couldn't remember the last time he'd surprised his family with a visit. Usually, his trips home were planned weeks in advance, with detailed schedules and specific arrival times. His father would pick him up at the airport, and they'd drive to the house where Sophie would be waiting on the front porch, dressed in her best clothes and practically vibrating with excitement. This time would be different. This time he wanted to see what their real life looked like when they weren't preparing for his arrival. David rented a car at the airport instead of calling his father. The 40-minute drive to his childhood neighborhood felt strange and familiar at the same time. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. The gas station where he'd bought candy as a kid had been replaced by a coffee shop. The vacant lot where he used to play baseball was now a strip mall. But when he turned onto Maple Street, his father's house looked exactly the same. The blue shutters needed a fresh coat of paint, and the front garden was a little overgrown, but it was still the house where he'd grown up, where he'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway, and where his mother had called him in for dinner every night at 6 o'clock sharp. David parked across the street, suddenly nervous. What if they weren't home? What if Sophie was at a friend's house or at some after-school activity he didn't know about? He realized with a sinking feeling that he had no idea what his daughter's daily routine looked like. He sent money every month for her care, expensive gifts on her birthday and Christmas, but he didn't know if she played any sports or had any hobbies. The front door of the house was painted a cheerful yellow that Patricia had chosen when she moved in. David's mother had always kept it white, but he had to admit the yellow looked nice, welcoming. He could see Patricia's influence in other small details too. New flower boxes under the windows, a decorative wind chime hanging from the porch, a small garden gnome peeking out from behind the mailbox. David sat in his car for a few minutes watching the house. He could see movement through the kitchen window. Someone was home. His heart started beating faster as he imagined Sophie's face when she saw him. Would she run into his arms like she used to when she was smaller? Or would there be that awkward moment of adjustment that had started happening during his recent visits, where she seemed to need a few minutes to remember that he was her father, and not just a visitor? A garbage truck rumbled down the street, and David realized he was being ridiculous. He was a grown man sitting in a car across from his own father's house like some kind of stalker. He grabbed the small bag of gifts he'd bought at the airport, a stuffed elephant for Sophie and a bottle of his father's favorite whiskey, and crossed the street. The walkway to the front door was lined with the same marigolds his mother had planted every spring. For a moment, David could almost see her kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil, explaining to 5-year-old David why flowers needed water and sunshine to grow. The memory was so vivid it took his breath away. He was reaching for the doorbell when he heard voices coming from inside the house. His father's voice, deep and familiar, a woman's voice that must be Patricia, and then, like music, Sophie's laugh. His daughter was home and she sounded happy. David's finger hovered over the doorbell. In a few seconds, everything would change. The surprise would be over and the visit would begin. But for this one perfect moment, he could stand on his childhood porch and listen to his daughter's laughter floating through the walls of the house where he'd grown up. For this one moment, everything felt exactly as it should be. He pressed the doorbell and waited for his life to begin again. The doorbell echoed through the house, but nobody came to answer it. David could still hear voices inside, but they seemed to be coming from the back of the house now. He pressed the bell again and waited. Still nothing. Growing up in this neighborhood, nobody ever locked their doors during the day. David tried the handle and found it still unlocked. He stepped into the familiar entryway, calling out, "Hello? Dad, it's me." The house smelled different than he remembered. Instead of his mother's vanilla candles and his father's pipe tobacco, there was a sharp chemical smell like cleaning products. The furniture was different too. Patricia had redecorated with modern pieces that looked expensive but somehow made the house feel cold. "Dad?" David called again, setting his bag down by the door. "Sophie?" He heard his father's voice coming from upstairs, talking on the phone about something work-related. Patricia's voice came from somewhere toward the back of the house, but he couldn't make out the words. "And Sophie?" Where was Sophie? David walked through the living room toward the kitchen, his footsteps muffled by the new carpet. As he got closer to the kitchen, Patricia's voice became clearer. She was talking to someone, but David couldn't hear another voice responding. Maybe she was on the phone too. He was almost to the kitchen doorway when Patricia's words stopped him cold. "I don't care if you're tired. You made this mess and you're going to clean it up properly this time. And stop that crying." "Nobody wants to hear it." David froze. The tone in Patricia's voice was nothing like the sweet, grandmotherly way she spoke when he visited. This voice was harsh, angry, mean. "Please," he heard a small voice say. "I didn't mean to spill it. It was an accident. Sophie." That was Sophie's voice, but she sounded different. Scared. Nothing like the confident, bubbly little girl who video called him every Sunday night. David moved closer to the kitchen doorway, staying out of sight. What he saw through the doorway made his blood turn to ice. Sophie was on her hands and knees on the kitchen floor, scrubbing at a small stain with a rag. Her clothes were old and too small for her. Her hair, which had been neatly braided in the photo his father sent yesterday, was now messy and hanging in her face. And she was crying. Patricia stood over her, arms crossed, watching with a look of disgust on her face. "You're doing it wrong. Scrub harder. And I told you to stop crying." "I am scrubbing hard," Sophie said quietly, her little arms working frantically with the rag. "Don't talk back to me," Patricia snapped. "You spilled juice on my clean floor and now you need to fix it. This is what happens when you're careless." David's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to burst into the kitchen and scoop Sophie up in his arms, but something held him back. He needed to see more. He needed to understand what was really happening in this house. "There," Sophie said, sitting back on her heels. "Is that better?" Patricia bent down and inspected the spot. "I guess it'll have to do. Now take that dirty rag and wash it out in the basement sink. And don't drip water on the stairs." Sophie struggled to her feet, and David could see that her knees were red from kneeling on the hard floor. She looked so small, so tired. This wasn't the same child who'd been laughing just minutes ago. "After you wash the rag, you can start on the bathrooms upstairs," Patricia continued. "I want them spotless before your grandfather gets home." "But I already cleaned them yesterday," Sophie said quietly. "Are you arguing with me?" "No, ma'am." "Good. Because little girls who argue don't get dinner. You remember what happened last week, don't you?" Sophie's shoulders sagged. "Yes, ma'am." David watched his daughter walk toward the basement door carrying the dirty rag. She moved like a much older person, like someone who was tired all the way down to their bones. When had she learned to walk like that? When had the light gone out of her eyes? Patricia pulled out her phone and started scrolling through it, completely ignoring the child she'd just sent to do more cleaning. After a few minutes, she called upstairs. "Robert, I'm going to the grocery store. Keep an eye on the girl." David heard his father's muffled response from upstairs. "Okay, honey. Drive safe." The front door opened and closed, and Patricia was gone. David stood in the hallway, his mind racing. What he'd just witnessed wasn't discipline. It wasn't teaching responsibility. It was something much worse. He heard Sophie coming back up the basement stairs, and he quickly moved away from the kitchen, ducking into the small bathroom near the front door. Through the cracked door, he watched Sophie trudge up the main staircase with cleaning supplies, her thin shoulders bent under the weight of the bucket. David's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it automatically and saw it was from Patricia. "At store. Forgot to mention David is coming for dinner Sunday. Make sure house is extra clean. Sunday." That was 4 days away. Patricia knew he was coming, but she hadn't told Sophie. Why would she keep that a secret? Unless Sophie wasn't supposed to be doing all this cleaning when David was around. David waited until he heard Sophie moving around in the upstairs bathroom before creeping toward the kitchen. He needed to see more of the house, needed to understand what Sophie's life was really like here. The kitchen was immaculate, but there were signs that bothered him. Only 2 plates in the dish drainer, even though 3 people lived in the house. A small plastic cup that looked like something you'd give to a toddler, not an 8-year-old. And in the trash, he saw several empty containers from expensive takeout restaurants. Enough food for 2 people, not 3. David made his way upstairs, following the sound of Sophie cleaning. He found her in the guest bathroom, standing on a step stool to reach the mirror, carefully wiping away every spot and streak. She was working with the focused concentration of someone who knew they'd be in trouble if the job wasn't perfect. "Sophie," he said softly. She spun around so fast she nearly fell off the step stool. When she saw him, her face went through a series of emotions: surprise, joy, confusion, and then something that looked like fear. "Daddy?" she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe he was real. "Hey, sweetheart." David stepped into the bathroom and lifted her down from the step stool. She felt lighter than she should, thinner than he remembered. "What are you doing?" "I'm cleaning," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Patricia says the bathrooms need to be perfect." "Why aren't you playing? It's Tuesday afternoon. Don't you have toys or books or something fun to do?" Sophie looked confused by the question. "I have to finish my chores first. Patricia says little girls who don't do their chores don't deserve to play." David knelt down so he was at Sophie's eye level. This close, he could see that she looked tired, and there were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been in any of the photos his father sent. "Sweetheart, how often do you have to do chores like this?" "Every day," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Patricia makes me a list in the morning, and I have to finish everything before Grandpa gets home from work." "What kind of things are on the list?" Sophie started counting on her fingers. "Clean the bathrooms, vacuum the living room, dust the furniture, wash the dishes, sweep the kitchen, make my bed, clean the baseboards, organize the closet." She ran out of fingers and looked confused. David felt sick. These weren't age-appropriate chores. This was the work of a house cleaner, not a small child. "What about school? What about homework?" "I do my homework after dinner in my room. Patricia says I'm too loud for the rest of the house." "Where is your room, sweetheart?" "Downstairs." "In the basement." "It's not so bad. It's quiet down there. The basement." His daughter was sleeping in the basement, while Patricia's adult son from her previous marriage lived in Sophie's old bedroom upstairs. David had seen the son during his Christmas visit, a 22-year-old who spent most of his time playing video games and had never held a job. "Sophie," David said carefully, "are you happy here?" She looked at him with eyes that seemed much too old for her face. "I try to be good, Daddy. I try really hard to do everything right so Patricia won't be mad." "What happens when Patricia gets mad?" Sophie's lower lip started to tremble. "I'm not supposed to tell." "You can tell me anything, sweetheart. I'm your daddy. She says if I tell Grandpa or tell you about the rules, then I'll have to go live somewhere else. Somewhere far away where I won't see you anymore." Tears started rolling down her cheeks. "I don't want to go away, Daddy. I promise I can be better." David pulled his daughter into his arms, and she felt so small and fragile against his chest. How had he missed this? How had he been so blind? David held Sophie close, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed at him to grab his daughter and leave immediately, but he forced himself to think clearly. If he acted on emotion alone, Patricia would just deny everything. His father would be caught in the middle, probably not believing the accusations. And Sophie might end up paying the price for his impulsive reaction. He needed proof, real, undeniable evidence that would show his father exactly what was happening in his own house. "Sophie," he said gently, pulling back to look at her face. "I need you to do something for me, okay? I need you to pretend you don't know I'm here yet." She looked confused. "But you are here." "I know, sweetheart. But I want to surprise Grandpa when he gets home from work. Can you keep it a secret until then?" Sophie nodded solemnly. She was good at keeping secrets now, David realized with a sick feeling. Patricia had trained her to be. "Can you show me your room?" he asked. Sophie led him down to the basement, and David's heart broke a little more with each step. The basement was cold, damp, and barely finished. Sophie's room was really just a corner sectioned off with a cheap room divider. Her bed was a narrow cot with a thin blanket. Her clothes were kept in plastic bins stacked against the wall. "This is where you sleep?" David asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "It's not so bad," Sophie said quickly, as if she was worried he might think she was complaining. "Patricia says it builds character to not have everything handed to you." David looked around the dismal space and noticed something that made his blood boil. In the corner was a small desk where Sophie apparently did her homework. The wood was warped from the basement moisture, and the single lamp provided barely enough light to read. Next to it was a space heater that looked ancient and potentially dangerous. "Are you cold down here at night?" "Sometimes. But Patricia says if I get too cold, it means I didn't work hard enough during the day to earn extra blankets." David pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. The basement room, the dangerous heater, the warped desk. He made sure to capture how isolated and inadequate this space was for a child. "Sophie, I need to make some phone calls, but I don't want Patricia to know I'm here yet. Is there somewhere I can hide until she gets back?" Sophie thought for a moment. "There's a big closet in the upstairs hallway. Patricia never goes in there. It's where Grandpa keeps his old stuff." David followed Sophie back upstairs and found the closet she meant. It was perfect. He could see the main areas of the house through the partially opened door, but he'd be completely hidden. He settled in with his phone and camera, feeling like a detective gathering evidence in his own family's house. While he waited, David called his assistant back in Seattle. "Kelly, I need you to do something for me, and it's urgent. I need you to pull all the bank records for the account I used to send money to my father for Sophie's care." "Of course, Mr. Richardson. Is there a problem?" "I'm not sure yet. I also need you to find me the best family law attorney in Columbus, Ohio. Someone who specializes in child custody and welfare cases." "Should I ask what this is about?" "Not yet. Just get me those records and that attorney's contact information as soon as possible." David hung up and settled in to wait. Through the closet door he could see Sophie moving around the house, systematically cleaning each room with the efficiency of someone who'd done this routine hundreds of times. She worked quickly but carefully, checking and double-checking her work. When he heard Patricia's car in the driveway, David started recording video on his phone. He watched Patricia come into the house carrying several shopping bags from expensive stores. She called out for Sophie immediately. "Girl, come help me with these bags." Sophie appeared instantly, as if she'd been waiting for the command. David watched through his phone screen as Patricia loaded his 8-year-old daughter with heavy shopping bags, making multiple trips from the car. "Did you finish the bathrooms?" Patricia asked. "Yes, ma'am." "What about the dusting?" "Yes, ma'am." "The kitchen floor?" "Yes, ma'am." Patricia walked through the house, inspecting Sophie's work with the critical eye of a drill sergeant. She ran her finger along picture frames, checking for dust. She examined the bathroom fixtures for water spots. She even got down on her hands and knees to check the baseboards. "This corner isn't clean enough," she said, pointing to a spot near the kitchen cabinets. "Do it again." David watched his daughter get back down on her hands and knees to re-clean a spot that looked perfectly clean to him. The casual cruelty of it made him grip his phone so tightly his knuckles went white. "When you're done with that, you can start preparing dinner," Patricia continued. "Your grandfather will be home in an hour and the food better be ready." "What should I make?" Sophie asked. "Figure it out. You're old enough to plan a simple meal." Patricia disappeared into the living room, leaving 8-year-old Sophie to plan and cook dinner for 3 adults. David watched his daughter stand in the kitchen, looking overwhelmed and exhausted. trying to figure out what she could manage to prepare. His phone buzzed with a text from Kelly. The bank records had been sent to his email, along with contact information for 3 highly rated family attorneys. David quickly scanned the bank records and felt his anger reach a new level. For the past 18 months, he'd been sending $3,000 a month to his father's account specifically for Sophie's care. The records showed that most of that money had been withdrawn in cash or spent at high-end stores and restaurants. Meanwhile, his daughter was wearing clothes that didn't fit and sleeping on a cot in a basement. David heard his father's car pulling into the garage and quickly stopped recording. He watched through the closet door as his father came into the house, calling out cheerful greetings. "Honey, I'm home," Robert called to Patricia. "In here," Patricia called back from the living room, her voice instantly switching to the sweet, loving tone David remembered from his visits. His father walked through the kitchen, where Sophie was struggling to reach something in a high cabinet. "Need help there, sweetheart?" Robert asked, lifting her up to reach what she needed. "Thank you, Grandpa," Sophie said. But even David could hear the careful politeness in her voice instead of the natural affection that used to be there. "What are you making for dinner?" "Spaghetti," Sophie said, with the sauce from the jar. "Sounds perfect. You're getting to be quite the little chef." David watched his father ruffle Sophie's hair affectionately, completely unaware that his granddaughter had been working like a servant all day. The casual blindness of it frustrated David almost as much as Patricia's cruelty. How could his father not see what was happening in his own house? Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Robert, darling, how was your day?" She kissed David's father on the cheek and immediately began chatting about her day. Shopping, lunch with friends, a hair appointment. She painted a picture of a leisurely, pleasant day, while Sophie continued working quietly in the background, invisible to both adults. "Sophie's been such a good helper today," Patricia said, as if she was praising a pet, rather than talking about a child. "She's learning so much about responsibility and taking care of a household." David's father beamed. "That's wonderful. It's important for children to learn those skills early." "Exactly what I always say," Patricia agreed. "Children today are so spoiled. Sophie is learning the value of hard work." David bit back the urge to scream. Patricia was twisting everything, making the abuse sound like good parenting, and his father, trusting and kind-hearted, was buying every word of it. Over the next hour, David documented the evening routine. Sophie served dinner to the adults but ate her own smaller portion standing up in the kitchen. She cleaned the dishes immediately after everyone finished eating. She swept the floor and wiped down all the surfaces while Patricia and Robert relaxed in the living room watching television. At 8 o'clock, Patricia called from the living room. "Sophie, bedtime." "But I haven't finished my homework yet," Sophie called back. "Then you should have worked faster today." "Homework is your responsibility to manage." David watched his daughter gather her school books and head down to the basement, her thin shoulders sagging with exhaustion. She was 8 years old, and she was being treated like an unpaid servant in her own grandfather's house. David waited until the house was quiet, then quietly let himself out through the back door. He sat in his rental car in the darkness, going through the photos and videos he'd captured. The evidence was clear and damning, but he needed more. He needed to show the pattern, the daily reality of Sophie's life. Tomorrow he would come back, and the day after that. He would document everything until he had enough evidence to ensure that Sophie never had to live like this again. But tonight, he had to drive to a hotel and try to sleep, knowing that his little girl was alone in a cold basement, probably crying into her pillow and wondering why her daddy never came to save her. David spent 3 more days gathering evidence, each day more heartbreaking than the last. He documented Patricia's daily routine of verbal cruelty, Sophie's impossible list of chores, and the stark contrast between how his daughter was treated versus Patricia's adult son, who lounged around the house playing video games while Sophie scrubbed floors. By Friday morning, David had enough evidence to fill a legal brief. Photos, videos, audio recordings, and detailed notes about everything he'd witnessed. He'd also spent hours on the phone with Jennifer Walsh, the family attorney Kelly had found. Jennifer had 20 years of experience in child welfare cases and had reviewed all of David's evidence. "This is more than enough to prove neglect and emotional abuse," she'd told him. "The question is how you want to proceed. We could involve Child Protective Services, but that might traumatize Sophie further. Sometimes family intervention works better if the adults are willing to listen to reason." David had made his decision. Today he would confront Patricia and his father together. He'd arranged everything carefully. Robert was taking a half-day from work. Patricia thought she was meeting a friend for lunch but would find David waiting instead. And Sophie would be safely at school during the confrontation. At 11 o'clock, David parked in front of his father's house one more time. This time he walked straight up to the front door and rang the bell. When Patricia answered, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then a quickly masked flash of panic. "David, what a wonderful surprise. We weren't expecting you until Sunday." "Hello, Patricia. I think we need to talk." "Of course. Come in, come in. Your father will be so excited to see you. He's just running a quick errand, but he'll be back soon." David stepped into the house, noting how different it felt now that he knew the truth. The perfectly clean surfaces that Sophie had scrubbed on her hands and knees, the spotless floors that his daughter mopped every day, the dust-free shelves that she reached with dangerous step stools. "Can I get you some coffee? Something to eat?" Patricia was using her sweetest voice, the one she always used when David visited. "No, thank you. I'd prefer to wait for my father before we start talking." Patricia's smile faltered slightly. "Start talking about what?" "I think you know." For the next 15 minutes, they sat in uncomfortable silence. Patricia kept trying to make small talk, but David responded with only short answers. He could see her growing more nervous by the minute. Finally, they heard Robert's car in the driveway. "David!" His father's face lit up as he walked through the door. "What are you doing here?" "This is a wonderful surprise." David stood up and hugged his father, but he could feel the tension in his own body. "Hi, Dad, we need to have a conversation. All three of us." Robert looked between David and Patricia, sensing something serious in the air. "What's going on?" "Let's sit down," David said. He pulled out his phone and opened the video he'd recorded 2 days ago. "I want to show you both something." The video started with Patricia standing over Sophie in the kitchen, watching the child scrub the floor while tears streamed down her face. Patricia's voice was harsh and cruel as she criticized Sophie's technique and called her clumsy and worthless. Robert's face went pale as he watched. What is this?" "This is what happens in your house every day when you're at work, Dad. That's not—" "I don't understand." Robert looked at Patricia, confusion and dawning horror in his eyes. Patricia jumped up from her chair. "This is taken out of context. Sophie had spilled juice everywhere and made a huge mess. I was teaching her responsibility." David scrolled to another video. This one showed Patricia forcing Sophie to clean the same bathroom 3 times because she'd found imaginary problems with the child's work. Then another video of Sophie carrying heavy bags of groceries while Patricia walked empty-handed. Then photos of Sophie's basement room, the inadequate bed, the dangerous heater. "Stop," Robert said quietly. "Just stop." But David wasn't finished. He pulled up the bank records on his phone. "Dad, I send $3,000 a month for Sophie's care. Can you tell me where that money has been going?" Robert looked at Patricia, who had gone completely silent. "Patricia handles the household finances," she said. "She said the money was going into Sophie's college fund. It's been going to designer handbags and expensive restaurants," David said. "Look at these receipts. While Sophie wears clothes that don't fit and sleeps on a cot in the basement." "The basement?" Robert's voice cracked. "Sophie's room is upstairs. The yellow room with the butterfly wallpaper." "Not anymore," David said. "Show him, Patricia. Show him where his granddaughter actually sleeps." Patricia's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. That child is spoiled and ungrateful. She needed to learn discipline and respect. She's 8 years old." David shouted, his control finally snapping. "She's a baby and you've been treating her like a servant. I've been trying to teach her valuable life skills while you swan around the country playing businessman and completely ignoring your responsibilities as a father." "Patricia!" Robert's voice was sharp with shock. David had never heard his gentle father use that tone before. "It's true," Patricia continued, her voice getting shrill. "He dumps his daughter here and sends money like that makes up for being an absent parent. Someone has to teach that child how the real world works. By making her scrub floors and sleep in a basement?" David pulled up more photos on his phone. "By making her cook dinner and do laundry and clean bathrooms while your precious son plays video games all day?" Robert stood up slowly, his face white with shock and growing anger. "Patricia, is this true? Has Sophie really been living like this?" "She's learning character and work ethic," Patricia said. but her voice was less confident now. Things you and David clearly never taught her. She's 8 years old, Robert repeated, his voice hollow. Patricia, she's just a little girl. David played one more video, the one that had broken his heart completely. It showed Sophie late at night after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting on her cot in the basement and quietly crying into her thin pillow. She was whispering to herself, practicing apologies for mistakes she might make the next day. The sound of his daughter's quiet sobs filled the living room. Robert made a strangled noise and sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. Where is she now? Robert asked, his voice muffled. School, David said. She'll be home in 2 hours. Robert looked up and David could see tears in his father's eyes. How long? How long has this been going on? David looked at Patricia, who had gone silent again. Based on what Sophie told me, it started about 6 months after you got married. It got worse over time. 2 years, Robert whispered. My granddaughter has been living like this for 2 years and I didn't know. She was afraid to tell you, David said gently. Patricia convinced her that if she complained, she'd be sent away and never see either of us again. Robert's face hardened as he looked at his wife. Get out. Robert, you're not thinking clearly. Let me explain. Get out of my house now. This is my home too. You can't just get out, Robert roared, standing up with a fury David had never seen from his gentle father. You have been abusing my granddaughter in my own house. Pack your things and get out before Sophie comes home from school. Patricia's face twisted with rage. You'll regret this. That spoiled brat has you both wrapped around her little finger and you're too stupid to see it. If you're not gone in 1 hour, I'm calling the police, Robert said coldly. Patricia stormed upstairs and they could hear her slamming drawers and throwing things around. Robert collapsed back into his chair, looking 20 years older than he had an hour ago. How did I not see it? He asked, staring at his hands. How could I have been so blind? David sat down next to his father. She was careful. She made sure you never saw the worst of it. And Sophie was too scared to tell the truth. That poor baby. Living in my house, being treated like that, while I thought everything was fine. Robert's voice broke. What kind of grandfather am I? The kind who's going to make this right, David said firmly. We both are. They heard Patricia's car screech out of the driveway. Through the window, David could see her stuffing suitcases into her trunk, her face dark with anger. She'll be home soon, Robert said, checking his watch. Sophie will be home soon. What do we tell her? The truth, David said. That she's safe now. That no one will ever treat her like that again. And that both of us are sorry we let it happen. Robert nodded, wiping his eyes. I want to see her room. Her real room. I want to see what I allowed to happen in my own house. They went down to the basement together, and Robert's reaction to seeing Sophie's living conditions was everything David had expected. His father stood in the cold, damp space and wept openly for the granddaughter he'd failed to protect. Never again, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. She's never sleeping down here again. We're going to fix this, son. We're going to make this right. David put his arm around his father's shoulders. Yes, we are. Starting today. The yellow school bus pulled up to the corner at exactly 3:15, just like it had every day for the past 2 years. But today was different. Today, both David and Robert stood waiting at the end of the driveway. And when Sophie saw them, her face showed a mixture of confusion and hope that nearly broke David's heart all over again. Daddy? She called out as she walked slowly toward them, her backpack dragging behind her. Grandpa? Why are you both here? David knelt down and opened his arms. Come here, sweetheart. Sophie dropped her backpack and ran into his embrace, and this time when he held her, he could feel her truly relax for the first time in years. She wasn't holding herself stiffly, waiting for the next command or criticism. She was just a little girl hugging her father. Where's Patricia? Sophie asked, looking around nervously. She's gone, Robert said gently, kneeling down beside David. She's not coming back, sweetheart. Sophie's eyes widened. Am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong? No, baby, David said, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't do anything wrong. You've never done anything wrong. We're the ones who made mistakes, and we're so sorry. Over the next hour, sitting together in the living room, David and Robert carefully explained what had happened. They told Sophie that Patricia's behavior wasn't normal or acceptable. They explained that children weren't supposed to do endless chores or sleep in basements or be afraid all the time. Most importantly, they told her that none of it had been her fault. You mean I don't have to clean the bathrooms anymore? Sophie asked, as if she couldn't quite believe it. The only thing you have to do is be a kid, David said. Play, go to school, have fun, make friends. All the things 8-year-old girls are supposed to do. What about dinner? Who's going to cook dinner? Robert laughed, though there were tears in his eyes. Grandpa can cook dinner, sweetheart. That's a grown-up job, not a little girl job. The next few days were a careful process of rebuilding trust and establishing new routines. David took an extended leave from his company, something that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. He moved Sophie's belongings from the basement back up to her old room, and they spent an entire afternoon redecorating it exactly the way she wanted. I can really choose any color I want for the walls? Sophie asked, holding paint samples up to the light. Any color in the world, David confirmed. She chose a soft lavender that reminded her of her mother's favorite flowers. As they painted together, Sophie began talking more freely about her experiences over the past 2 years. Not everything at once. David and Robert were careful not to push, but slowly, in bits and pieces, the full picture emerged. Patricia had been systematic in her cruelty. She'd convinced Sophie that her father didn't really want her around, that the only way to earn love was through perfect behavior and constant work. She'd told Sophie that if she complained or told the truth, she'd be sent to foster care where no one would love her at all. I tried so hard to be good, Sophie told David one evening, as he tucked her into her real bed with soft sheets and warm blankets. I thought if I could just do everything perfectly, maybe you'd want to come home more often. David's heart shattered all over again. Baby, I want to be with you all the time. The only reason I stayed away was because I thought you were happy and safe here. I should have paid more attention. I should have seen what was really happening. It's okay, Daddy, you're here now. But David knew it would take more than his presence to heal the damage that had been done. He found a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, and Sophie began seeing Dr. Martinez twice a week. At first, Sophie was reluctant to talk to a stranger, but Dr. Martinez was patient and kind, and gradually Sophie began to open up about her feelings. Sophie has been living in survival mode for 2 years, Dr. Martinez explained to David and Robert during a private session. She's learned to suppress her own needs and emotions in order to avoid punishment. It's going to take time for her to learn that she's allowed to have feelings, allowed to make mistakes, allowed to just be a child. The healing process had setbacks. Sometimes Sophie would wake up in the middle of the night, panicked that she'd forgotten to complete some imaginary chore. She would apologize constantly for normal childhood behavior, spilling a drop of juice, leaving a toy on the floor, asking for a snack. She flinched whenever an adult raised their voice, even when they weren't angry at her. But there were victories, too. The first time Sophie laughed at one of Robert's silly jokes, really laughed the way she used to, David felt like his heart might burst with relief. The first time she asked for help with her homework instead of struggling alone. The first time she complained about being bored, like a normal child who expected the adults in her life to help her find something fun to do. 3 months after Patricia left, David made a decision that surprised even him. He sold his company. You can't be serious, his business partner said during the negotiation meeting. This company is your life. It's worth $50 million. My daughter is my life, David corrected. The company is just a company. He kept enough money to live comfortably and set up a generous college fund for Sophie. But the rest went towards starting something new, a foundation that helped identify and support children in situations like Sophie's. He partnered with schools, social services, and community organizations to create programs that taught people how to recognize signs of abuse and how to help children who were afraid to speak up. We can't save every child, he told Robert as they worked together to set up the foundation's first office. But maybe we can save some. Maybe we can make sure other kids don't have to go through what Sophie went through. Robert, who had retired early to help care for Sophie, became the foundation's first volunteer coordinator. He threw himself into the work with the passion of someone who had something to make up for. The legal proceedings against Patricia were swift and decisive. Jennifer Walsh had built an airtight case, and Patricia was convicted of child endangerment and financial fraud. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution for the money she'd stolen from Sophie's care fund. Will I have to see her again? Sophie asked when David explained that Patricia would be going to jail. Not unless you want to, David promised. And you never have to want to. Sophie thought about this for a moment. I don't want to. Is that okay? That's perfectly okay, sweetheart. 1 year after the confrontation, Sophie was a different child. She'd gained weight and grown 3 inches. Her hair was shiny and healthy again. She'd made friends at school and joined the children's choir at Robert's church. She still saw Dr. Martinez once a month, but now their sessions were more about normal growing up challenges than trauma recovery. "I want to help other kids," Sophie announced one day while she and David were volunteering at the Foundation's weekend program. "Kids who are scared like I was. How do you want to help them?" David asked. "I want to tell them that it gets better, that if they tell the truth, grown-ups will believe them and help them." Sophie began speaking at the Foundation's training seminars, sharing her story in age-appropriate ways to help adults understand what children in abusive situations were going through. She was poised and confident in a way that amazed everyone who remembered the frightened, exhausted child she'd been just a year earlier. "My name is Sophie," she would tell the audiences of teachers, social workers, and community volunteers. "When I was little, I lived with someone who was mean to me. I was scared to tell anyone because I thought it was my fault. But it wasn't my fault, and it's not any kid's fault when grown-ups are mean to them." David would watch his daughter speaking to these groups, and he would marvel at her strength and resilience. She had taken her pain and turned it into purpose, her trauma into triumph. On a warm spring evening 2 years after Patricia left, David tucked Sophie into bed in her lavender room filled with books and toys and all the things a child should have. She was reading a story about a brave princess who rescued herself from a tower, and she looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with confidence and joy. "Daddy, do you think we saved each other?" she asked. David smiled and kissed her forehead. "I think we definitely saved each other, sweetheart." "Good," Sophie said, settling back into her pillows. "I like our family the way it is now." "Me too, baby. Me too." As David turned off the light and headed downstairs, he could hear Robert in the kitchen, humming while he prepared Sophie's lunch for school the next day. Normal, loving grandfather things. The house felt warm and safe and full of the kind of love that had always been there, but had been hidden under layers of manipulation and fear. David stepped out onto the front porch and looked up at the stars. Tomorrow, Sophie would go to school and come home excited to tell them about her day. Robert would help her with homework while David cooked dinner. They would laugh together and plan weekend activities and argue about bedtimes in the wonderful, ordinary way that healthy families do. It had taken losing everything he thought mattered to discover what actually did matter, and in the end he'd gained far more than he'd lost. He'd gained his daughter's trust, his father's forgiveness, and most importantly, the knowledge that he would never again let work or money or anything else come between him and the people he loved. The foundation they'd built would help other children find their voices and their safety. Sophie would grow up knowing that she was strong enough to overcome anything, and David would spend every day for the rest of his life making sure that his daughter knew she was loved, protected, and valued for exactly who she was. Sometimes the most important homecomings weren't about returning to a place. Sometimes they were about finding your way back to the people who mattered most.